otherwise all is good. So tonight's class is something what I think quite fascinating. We're going to visit numerous Jewish responses to epidemics. So we're going to go through different pandemics and epidemics and see how Jews around the world and historically have responded to this. Like, we know historically that this is not the first pandemic in history. We've had many of them, unfortunately, and we have always somehow come out okay, survived them. So we're going to survive this. That's the good news. What we're going to see is that Jews probably had somewhat of a different response than other people. Sorry, just trying to find the first question. Okay, so we know that if we talk about this particular pandemic, unfortunately, it's taken the world by storm. Travel around the world has stopped. Healthcare workers are now totally overrun. Yeah. We have come to, here in Melbourne, I think we are experiencing our first curfew ever, at least first full-flung curfew. I don't know. I've only been in Melbourne for 8 years, but some of you have been in Melbourne for probably a lot longer than I have. And because of that, you're probably finding it somewhat interesting to be in a situation where you cannot even leave your house at night. I usually think of a curfew when bombs are falling all over, left, right, and center. I don't think of something invisible making me have to stay home. That's just not what I think of. Something that I cannot even see that is caused the whole town to come to a total drop and descent in all its work. I think this is quite incredible. Not that I'm saying that I think it's good, of course not. But of course, Judaism has had interesting responses to this. And each way that we're going to look at tonight, how different communities or different ways of responding could give us a little bit of ideas for our particular times. Okay, so we're going to divide our class tonight into 3 sections. Part number 1 will talk about practical guidance, medical advice that we find within Jewish texts. Fascinating enough, the Talmud itself talks about how to respond to things like a pandemic, which I think is quite fascinating. The second area we're going to discuss tonight is the responses from a religious and spiritual standpoint that have taken place over time. And the third is going to be changes in communal practices and patterns. So let's look first and foremost at those practical guidelines. In the times of the Talmud, now the Talmud was written in the 5th century, finally compiled in the 5th century. It started some 2,000 years ago, when it's a discussion of all the halachic discussions that happened over the previous 400 years, but really delving into the Mishnah, which was those 400 years prior. The Talmud gives us some interesting insight into how people, the rabbis of those times, how they responded to pandemics. So in the Talmud of Ketubot, listen to these fascinating ideas and tell me if you think that these are somewhat relevant. It gives us 4 examples of responses. The first one was by Rabbi Yochanan. And in those days, there was the disease called Ra'atam. Now, it was an infectious disease that was transmitted from person to person and could be quite severe and often killed many people. That's the way we understand it from the Talmud. It doesn't go into much more description over there. So what did Rabbi Yochanan do? Welcome Alex, welcome Buzz, welcome Ruvain. He said like this: be careful of the flies found on those afflicted with the Ra'atan, as they are carriers of the disease. Okay, that's Rabbi Yochanan. Now, just bear in mind that all these statements that we're going to be are way, way before we knew anything about germs or viruses or bacteria. This is this is relatively modern. In the 1800s is, I think, when they started discovering some of these things. The second quote is going to be from Rabbi Zera. He said he would not sit on a spot where the wind blew from the direction of someone inflicted with Ra'atan. Okay, so he wouldn't even sit in that place. Joe looks exciting. I'm hoping that I'm keeping you strong and well. Number 3 was Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar said that he would not enter the tent of one afflicted with Ra'atan. And number 4 were the actual authors of the Talmud, known as Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, and they said that they would not eat eggs from an alley in which someone afflicted with Ra'atan lived. Now,
when did these guys live, please?
These people lived some 1700 years ago, between 1700 and 1500 years ago. Now, what I find fascinating is that this is way before any knowledge about how viruses spread. Yet here you have all these people literally finding all these different ways of how they would avoid the spread of the virus. So, what do we see over here? We see one man that wouldn't even let the air be blowing in the direction of somebody coming from Ra'atan. So many different ways of how people handled the concept of social distancing. The only one I find relatively strange out of these four statements is the fourth one, actually, that they would not eat the eggs from an alley in which someone afflicted with Ra'atan lived. I suppose they thought or believed, and very possibly could have been true, that they had somehow become contaminated and they had probably touched those eggs and therefore could be passing on the disease. But they were very aware that the infection grew and it was something that you couldn't see, and that they had to be careful about, as some people call social distancing, or perhaps physical distancing. Another Talmud from a different place in Bava Kama is from the man Rava. Rava is probably a century or two earlier than them, and he said that during a pandemic, he would keep his windows shut. Another source that we have from the Talmud is that they spoke about when there was these epidemics. Rabbis advised that when traveling during an epidemic, one should stick to the sides of the street. Why do you think that they advised people to stick to the sides of the street? What idea do you have about that?
You don't have money.
Sorry? I'll tell you my idea. What I think the reason why they wanted people to stick to the sides of the street is the Talmud over there explains that when they would stick to the side of the street, they said that the angel of death traveled in the middle of the street during the time of epidemic. Now, to us, or to some people, that might sound like a bunch of, I don't know what the word, hogwash is what some people would call it. But I think maybe a few years ago we would have thought about it, but today's day and age, where we've been told that we should be keeping social distancing and keeping our distance from each other, I think, to me, that makes a lot of sense. What do you guys think? I'd love to hear what anybody thinks. Let me know. But meantime, I'll go on, and I'm going to talk about another incident or other incidents within the Torah or within rabbinic literature that talks about how the Jewish people responded. Unless there's any comments or people that want to ask something. Okay.
No, I totally agree with what they've said, with what he said, that walking to the side of the street, because that was before they knew about masks, I guess. And
Right.
That would be the equivalent of us distancing ourselves. You know how we have 2, is it 1.5, 2 meters distance between each other, and wearing a mask.
100%, 100%. But I think I find it quite fascinating to see these discussions happening within rabbinical literature some between 15 and 20 centuries ago, way
Amazing.
before any knowledge of all these type of things that we have today.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wouldn't think
Rabbi,
so.
Yes.
could I add something about, you mentioned the angel of death, Malach HaMovet. That could, on the one hand, it could mean a specific angel. On the other hand, it could be a term for those pathogens, for those mortality-causing illnesses, which in the end, everything comes from Hashem, which could be via the Malach HaMovet.
100%. 100%. And I think the way I agree with you, and the way I look at it is that the angel of death is the way that was the language of the times for talking about that it was a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah, so we may have in science, we may have terms now for individual pathogens, organisms, but that's all just 20th, 21st century terminology. It's
Right,
equal,
exactly.
and Malach HaMovet is just as accurate as the terms we use now.
100%. Couldn't agree with you more. Thanks for that.
Hmm.
Okay, let's move on in history a little bit. Further down the line, we're going to jump to the next most widely accepted book from the Talmud, would have been the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch was compiled by Rabbi Yosef Karo in the land of Tzfat in the 1555, and his contemporary, the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, wrote notes for, so Rabbi Yosef Karo was the Sephardic authority of the time. So when he compiled the Shulchan Aruch, at the very same time, Reb Moshe Isserles was one of the most accepted rabbis. He was writing a book in Krakow, and when he realized that Reb Yosef Karo had already written it, he decided that there was no need for the Jewish people to have two separate books. And even though that many of the customs that had been written down by Yosef Karo were following the customs of the Sephardic Jews, he decided that he would use that book and make it into one book and have what he called Hagoyes, notes. And it's a very unusual book, but this is the Shulchan Aruch Code of Jewish Law that we all use today. Of course, there's much more discussion, and it's been rewritten, including those further discussions, but this was original Code of Jewish Law, bringing together the final conclusions, which is something we don't have in the Talmud. But in the Code of Jewish Law, in the notes of the Ramah, Reb Moshe Isserles from Krakow, the Ashkenazic authority, he talks about how in a time of a pandemic, one should leave the place and you should escape from the place where if there is a plague or a epidemic in a particular town, then there's no reason to hang around there. It's a dangerous place to be. You're likely to catch it, and if you have a way to leave, you should. He himself writes that he fled Krakow during a pandemic or epidemic, which is interesting. We'll revisit that whole idea later on as well. I think today's day and age in the world, we've learned that there's nowhere to hide. I know that I have a sister that lives in Florida, and when the pandemic first hit New York, many Jews go to Florida for Pesach. So they all decided that Purim was now Pesach, and they all started coming down, and all the people from Florida kept on telling the people from New York, please don't come, we don't want to spread the pandemic here. But I think we've learned that this pandemic has no boundaries, and unfortunately we see now Florida is one of the most heaviest hit places on earth with this pandemic. It just shows you, but this is not the same type of thing. This epidemic, don't forget, in those days things traveled far less than they do today. Although we do have certain cases. Interestingly enough, the Krakow, the Ramah that we're talking about in Krakow, I merited to be in his shul. I once went to visit Poland, and I went to see his shul. A fascinating place to be. His shul still exists. It's a very small shul, funnily enough. Okay, that was the Ramah. The next person was Rabbi Akiva Eger, the next famous writing. There's numerous writings. We're just picking some of the more famous ones. Rabbi Akiva Eger, one of the great sages of the 1800s. He's famous for having brilliant questions on the Talmud. And over there, it's very fascinating, because in March, when this pandemic was somewhat new to the rest of the world outside of China, and it was starting to affect Jewish communities, and Jewish communities started, I remember the first week that I hit here in Melbourne, and we started with shuls in small groups of 10 people. We thought, well, that's the way it would be. We never thought that they would totally shut down shuls. But what was going around was this letter from Rabbi Akiva Eiger that he used to spread about a letter that he wrote to Jewish communities that were badly affected by cholera. Now, between 1831 and 1966, the Jewish communities around the world were affected by 7 significant cholera breakouts. And as a result, the Jewish people actually renamed cholera to be called Cholei Ra. What does Cholei Ra mean? Anybody want to give a try? Cholei Ra could be translated as the evil sickness, or the bad sickness. That was the name that they gave to cholera, because unfortunately it had killed and taken the lives of so many. So what did he write? He wrote that in places that are affected by cholera, they should divide into groups for davening, and they should not allow more than 15 people at a time in a group. Right? In small locations, they should have shuls, and they should have so much so, they should be so strict. He said they should try to get the police to protect the buildings, not allowing a single person more than 15 to enter into the building, or if the police are not going to be assisting them, then in the very least, they should hire their own security guards. So it's fascinating to see how strict he did that, and that was something that was accepted. And I could tell you that here in Melbourne, where we were probably one of the first places in the world to close down our minyanim, and definitely Chabad over here was, and we went down into that lockdown, and the first thing we did was just after Purim, we already went into small breakout minyanim, and the next week I think it was already all over. So the fun and games had ended just like that. Of course, we reopened and then reclosed. So he goes on to talk about how we should be adding in certain prayers, and the prayers should be short to make space. They should start from early morning till late, so that everybody in the community should have an opportunity to join a minyan. Okay, that's the response of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. That is advice that has been used till this very day. The next was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter is known as the founder of the Musar movement. The Musar movement is the movement which, so to speak, tries to inspire people through telling them about how they're going to be affected, etc. I'm not going to get into what it is right now, but he's definitely goes down as a very, very incredible scholar in Jewish history. Now, in 1848, there was once again another breakout in Vilna, and he said that the breakout in the day, he said that it came Yom Kippur. He said that if people were too weak, they should not fast as a result of this breaking, and he didn't want people, even if they hadn't contracted any illness. We know today that if somebody is unwell, but very unwell, they talk to a rabbi who confides with a doctor, and they get what's called a patur, which means an exemption from fasting on Yom Kippur. That's something that we're reliant on today. But in that case, in that year, Rabbi Salanter gave this almost like unanimous exemption for everybody. And what he did is he himself broke the fast. And he went and made kiddush in front of his community to show people how serious it was. So people, they, for some reason, were not so concerned about people going to shul, but they were more concerned about the strength of people, and people being strong enough to withstand any type of illness. Okay. That's just one way of how we see how physically the rabbis have done things to prevent the spread of illnesses and infections. That's our first practical guidance. That's the first part of what I wanted to discuss. Now, why do we have this this perspective? Why do we rule this way? And the reason for that is because it's going to be based on two principles. The two principles, in other words, my question to you really is to explain the question is, why is it that Rabbi Salanter decided to break Yom Kippur? Why did he decide that to transgress the fasting of Yom Kippur? Why is it that we have decided to close shuls? Shouldn't we trust in God that if we do what he wants, everything will be okay? Or where do we have the right to stop Jewish practice? That's the question. And what is the basis on this in Jewish study to allow us to take such extreme measures? So it's going to be based on two major principles in Jewish law. The first principle is known as pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh means the preservance of life precedes all. It overrides everything. If you have a situation where somebody's life might be threatened by it, it overrides everything. The second concept is the concept of nitna reshus lerofim lirpos, that doctors are given permission to cure people. Okay, so let me explain to you how these two concepts work. When we talk about the first concept of pikuach nefesh, the preservation of life, we know that there's the three cardinal rules. That in general we say that a person is faced with having to transgress any Jewish commandment, they should transgress rather than lose their life. Except for three cases. What are the three cases? Anybody want to give it a go?
I can if you like.
Go ahead, Joe.
Avodah
Keep
Zarah.
the voice change. The voice change. Keep it more interesting. What are the three cases?
Well, worshipping our idols, basically. Avodah Zarah, idolatry, denying the existence of God.
Okay, that's the one. What's the second cardinal rule? Promiscuous relationships like adultery, etc. And the third one is murder. Okay, so unless we are asked to do any of those three, we are not allowed to transgress, or so to speak, to fulfill the mitzvah if it's going to be putting our lives in danger. So therefore, even if it's the slightest reason to think that it can put somebody's life in danger, we would have to transgress the mitzvah. So we got a mitzvah of davening with the minyan on shul on Shabbat. But those people coming together could be people putting people's lives in danger. It's not one of the three, so therefore we have to transgress. Even fasting on Yom Kippur is not one of the three mitzvahs that we're allowed to transgress the Torah for. What happens if a person is ill and the only food that they can eat to keep them alive, according to Torah or medicine, would be non-kosher food? They would be obligated to eat that non-kosher food. Okay, so that's the general concept. So that's been the overriding principle why we have changed Judaism and allowed Judaism to have such a major impact on our lives. Now, the second concept is somewhat more interesting. And I know that many of you are, of course, aware of that we are not like some Christian groups that don't believe in doctors. I'm not very well versed in this, but from my understanding, some Protestants and some Amish people, they don't necessarily believe in the use of medicine. Now, what's the theory behind not the use of medicine? The theory is that if God has caused a person to become ill, then that is the will of God, and we don't have the right to intervene. Judaism has a totally different perception. And the perception is that the Torah says, "V'rapo yerapeh," that you shall surely cure. That means when a person becomes ill, you shall cure him. That's a statement from the Torah. Says the Talmud and all the commentaries. From here we learn that when a person becomes ill, we are obligated to take that person to a professional in the field, and they should learn how to become doctors and be treated. So it's not just that we do the Christian perspective, and I'm saying it's not all Christians, it's only some, but that perspective is something which it seems somewhat logical. Why does it seem logical? Because why would we judge God's judgment, so to speak? Why would we try to intervene in God's plan? And the answer is, well, you would be correct if you didn't study the Torah. But when you go look at that same Torah that tells us that God is watching over us and he has a plan, and therefore we should accept our plan, tells us that when we do have the means to intervene, we're not only allowed to, we're obligated to use. So therefore science becomes something really important. You know, Martin Luther, in 1527, there was a breakout of the bubonic plague. And he told his followers that they should not go and seek medical support and assistance. They should not, because he said that since death is God's punishment, which he sends upon us for our sins, we must submit ourselves to God, and with a truth and firm faith, patently wait our punishment. Now, funnily enough, we all know that Martin Luther was, of course, a tremendous anti-Semite, and somebody who some people hold responsible for many. Some people would even say that he would have been the father of the thought of somebody like Hitler. Okay, of course, he originally started off supposedly as a friend of the Jews, but when the Jewish people, he thought that by friending the Jewish people, they would accept his new ways of the Protestant way of Christianity. When he saw that we weren't, he became the most horrific anti-Semite. But you see that some of those teachings apply still today. And that's why perhaps you would hear of some Christian groups that don't necessarily care that much about what doctors have to say. Okay, so just revisiting, we're obligated to follow the advice of Jewish of all doctors, of the science professionals of the time. Now, the next response I want to say, that's all the practical response, physical response, medicine, etc. The next response I want to get into is the spiritual responses. How do we look at it from a spiritual perspective? Does Judaism tell us to do anything spiritual, like praying or the like during these times? So here's the thing. We know that according to Judaism, there's dual worlds that exist. There's the spiritual world and there's the physical world. We see a world which is made up of body, physicality, physical materialistic world, but at the same time, there's something behind it which is driving the life force and the energy behind the world. If we were to try to divorce those two, we would be living in a very strange world. It would be living in a body without a soul. Now, what type of body would a person have without a soul? Would be a dead body. So just like we see a person is alive, that body is alive, all we see is the body, but we know that there is something spiritual which makes that person alive, something that we cannot see. That's the same concept exists in the whole world. So therefore, it's not enough. From a Jewish perspective, it simply ain't enough to listen to the doctors. That's first and foremost. That's what we have to do, yes. But it wouldn't suffice, because we have to recognize that anything that happens in this world has a spiritual counterpart, something that is causing it spiritually to happen. And therefore, there often is a spiritual way that we can also work with this. So we brought all these examples. Let's look into some of the more spiritual examples. You know, when we talk about the IDF is a physical group of soldiers that we need physically. We require those people in order to be able to protect ourselves against our enemies. But we would have to agree that the land of Israel is not a physical land, and we have to do spiritual things as well. The same thing is, the Torah tells us that we have to go out and make a living. We can't expect money just to arrive on our tables. We have to do something about it, go out and get a job. But at the same time, we have to remember that the blessings are coming from God. You can try as much as you want. There's certain things that we do like giving charity, like not working on Shabbat, and things like that, which are the spiritual tools to bring prosperity. So we're going to try to figure out a few ideas that have been provided historically to Jewish people about epidemics and how they got over it. Some of these are quite interesting. So the first example that we have actually comes from the Torah. I spoke about it in one of our previous shiurim. The example in the Torah is the Ketores. Actually, I think it may even have been last week. No, 2 weeks ago. The story with Korach. Remember the story with Korach when he rebels against the Jewish people, against Moses, and he says to Moses, "Why did you become the leader?" So after Korach is swallowed up in the ground with all his followers, there's a rebellion against Moses, and they play Moses. And when they play Moses, in that particular episode, a plague breaks out and thousands of Jews start to die. And as those Jewish people and this plague breaks out, Moses turns to his brother Aaron. Aaron is the high priest, and he tells Aaron, "You are the high priest. Quickly run and grab the Ketores." Now, what was the Ketores? The Ketores was the incense. And what had happened is Aaron's sons, earlier in the Torah, in the beginning, had brought the incense right when the tabernacle was inaugurated. And because they brought that incense out of place, they died. So the Ketores actually can kill a person. So Aaron's sons die because they brought us. Now the 250 followers of Korach, they also die because they had brought the Ketores and because they had rebelled against Aaron and Moses. Now Moses sees this plague and he says to Aaron, "Go and get the Ketores, and the Ketores will actually be able to save the lives of the Jewish people." Moses runs to the tabernacle, he burns the Ketores, the incense, and as a result, the plague immediately stops. We spoke about this, we talked about angels, how an angel had come involved, the angel of death, a fascinating episode. Interestingly enough, do you know where Moses got this idea from? The Midrash tells us that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, after receiving the Torah, each of the angels gave Moses a different gift, like a spiritual idea of a gift. And the gift given to Moses by what's known as the Malach HaMovet, the angel of death, was the gift of that if you take the incense, it can save lives when a plague breaks out. So that's how he actually has it. That's where he gets that idea from.
Rabbi, it'd be great if we could rediscover that at the moment.
Oh, that's the next question I was going to ask you. So what do we do today if we don't have the Ketores? So the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, and the author of the Shulchan Aruch as well, the later printed Shulchan, what's known as Shulchan Aruch, which is a revised Shulchan Aruch, which includes all the later commentaries, which he wrote in the 1700s. He writes that in a time of a pandemic or epidemic or a plague, we should all study the portion of the Ketoret. We should study it with its commentary of Rashi, which is found in Shemot, Exodus, chapter 30, verse 1 to 10. That discusses the golden altar, the side where the incense was offered. And Exodus chapter 30, the same chapter 12 verses later, 20 to 38 discusses the making of the anointing oil for the Ketores. And then in Numbers chapter 16 in Bamidbar, Perek Tedvav, over there, it talks about this whole story of the rebellion of Korach. If we study that portion, it will bring salvation. That's one of the advice given. So first spiritual tip given is to actually study the passage of Ketores. It's a fascinating concept that we find that by studying the passage of the Ketores, studying certain parts is another thing that says that today we do not bring sacrifices, but if you felt like you needed to bring a sacrifice just by studying about the sacrifices, it's as though you have brought it and you fulfilled that obligation. To all those people that say, how do we get atonement today? We get atonement by studying the Torah, and particularly those portions from the Torah, and so too with the Ketores. Okay, so there you see them on the board. Okay, the next let's go back in history a little bit to the time of King David. Now, in the times of King David had done something. He'd made somewhat of a mistake, and his mistake was he'd been very successful. He literally secured the Jewish people in a way that had never been till then, won tremendous amount of wars, and he decided to count the Jewish people. And we know that Torah law says we are not allowed to count the Jewish people. And a terrible plague breaks out, and King David doesn't know how to rectify his mistake until he comes across the verse which says, how do you do it? The word ma means what? And he says that the word ma could also be rewritten to say mea, 100. And from there, King David instituted the concept that Jewish people should say 100 blessings every day. Now, we do this today as Jewish people that pray 3 times a day. You have 19 blessings in each prayer. If you go through the whole of the davening, which some of it was actually instituted by King David and his court, you would get to close to 100 blessings every day. The only days we actually struggle is Shabbos and Yom Tov, and then they give us a whole bunch of ideas of how to do it. So by being more careful about those blessings, we're told actually can end the pandemic or assist in the pandemic.
Assist. Rabbi?
Yes.
May I add a perspective to that, which I've only just found recently, is that the concept of blessings, which includes being grateful. Sorry,
Yes.
I'll just mute this. There we go. Sorry, I just had a radio there. So the concept of blessings of saying thank you, essentially. One of the findings with COVID, with the disease, is that being under stress, mental stress, and the mental health pandemic that's concurrent with the viral pandemic, being under stress lowers lymphocytes and other cells in the immune system. It makes people more vulnerable, basically, just by being mentally stressed. And therefore, any routine that encourages people to be grateful for the things they do have and to say thank you, theoretically, it improves the immune system and makes people more resilient and better able to cope with any infection.
100%. 100%. So that's another tip that you could give. That's from Rav Joe. Could we call you Rav Joe? Is that okay?
I have no qualification there, but I did read some research in the last 2 weeks that surveys have been done of very Orthodox Jewish communities around the world, how they've been coping through these past few months. And one of the findings from Israel, I think, was and America, was that in spite of a higher case rate, indeed even a higher mortality rate, amongst the very orthodox, in terms of their levels of happiness and satisfaction and feelings of security and safety, their mental health, they scored higher than any other group.
Wow, very interesting.
And that was consistent around the world.
That is very interesting. Okay. Well, I think maybe it could be somewhat due to our Zoom classes that the communities around the world have been embracing. That we'll talk about that in a moment. That even though we may be somewhat distant from each other, we're still keeping up our communities online. And not only that, I think that our communities have grown. That something like Sinai Down Under, where it's not just a community, it's about 1,000 people that come together whenever that happens. That never would have happened and come together. While you don't see all those people, but the fact that you know that those people are present and the guidance and the learning, I think that all these type of things that we have in place definitely assists in those areas. Okay, let's go on to some other ideas that, okay, so the most famous pandemic in history, infamous I should call it, more than famous, is of course the Black Death. Now the Black Death started in China, which is quite fascinating, and was known as caused by a bacterium Yersinia pestis. From there, it was believed to have spread to Europe by Mongolian invaders. And following that, there was a battle in the Crimean Peninsula where they would actually start catapulting corpses which had the illness. It's like, you know, kind of modern day biological warfare, something quite horrific. It would go towards the Italian port and different cities in Europe, and that's how it really spread. So much so that it's believed that some 20 to 25 million Europeans died from this plague, from the Black Death, this sickness, just over a decade, and 35 Chinese people. So it started in Europe in 1346. And of course, who was famously blamed for this pandemic? The Jews. Yes. Why? There's not many Jews left there weren't many Jews in China, but of course we were blamed for poisoning the wells and all types of other horrific things. Now, this anti-hatred concept is something that is not new in Europe. It was going for 500 years at least before that. But one of the reasons given to why what they blamed it is that some people believe, some historians, and we do know that some Jews did die from the plague, but it's believed that Jews were less affected from the plague itself. And by being less affected by the plague, you know, people decided that the Jews had brought it. So unfortunately, what that caused was a bunch of pogroms and libels against the Jewish people. And the night of St. Valentine's Day, which was before the current meaning of that day, a day of romance and love, thousands of people were killed in the town of Basel, and in Strasbourg, 1,000 Jews were killed. Jews were forbidden from living in Strasbourg for 100 years as a result. There was mass suicide in Frankfurt, and the entire community of Erfurt was completely wiped out. So it had tremendous. Now, we do know that Jewish people died. Many historians say that why the Jewish community was far less affected by the Black Death is because of the Jewish practices, regular Jewish practices of hygiene. We know, for example, Judaism obligates us to wash our hands every morning. Okay, it's something that definitely was not practiced in those days. Sorry, Mike. Also, the way we bury bodies immediately. We try, if possible, not even to leave bodies overnight. We're very careful of how we contain. We also wash bodies before we go through the purity process. We are careful to wash ourselves every week. And think about in France in the 1400s, in the 1300s, that century, washing was almost done Never. What do we talk about? Some of those kings and queens doing it maybe once a year. That's when they invented deodorant, and along with deodorant came along a lot of death. But the Jewish people are obligated, according to the Talmud and Halacha, to bathe themselves at least once a week before Shabbos, which for those days would have been quite common and would have prevented. And there's many other rituals. We wash our hands before bread, the way we are in contact with people. All these things are believed by historians, secular historians as well, to have saved the Jewish people from this plague. So continuing these rituals, which were instituted by our rabbis by the destruction of the temple, is something which definitely has helped us not just to keep up those traditions, but also physically. Yes, Bernard.
Yeah, we don't view the dead bodies.
Yes, correct.
A lot of other people do.
So you're saying that that could have been a cause for something negative? For part of the negative repercussions, is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, 100%. Those are some of the reasons that are given. Okay, now let's look on further going on to so the Baal Shem Tov, he lived in the time in Mezhebuz in the 18th century between 1698 and 1760. There was a terrible disease that spread through Mezhebuz. And out of desperation, the Jews in that town came to the Baal Shem Tov, who was known to be a miracle worker. The Baal Shem Tov is the founder of the Hasidic movement. And one of the things that he did at that founding was he performed many, as way of founding the Jewish movement, is showing that there's a spiritual life force behind the world. And he did that by doing miracles. Now, they came to him and asked him to pray. And he said that saving you from this plague pandemic is actually in your own hands. How would you do that? He said that by writing a Sefer Torah, by writing a new Torah scroll, you can actually save the community. And the Torah says that they did write a Torah. The Baal Shem Tov himself hired his own sofer, the person that was responsible for writing tefillin and mezuzot for himself, that he would give out and use personally, and they started writing the Torah that became known as the Miracle Sefer Torah. Funnily enough, that when this pandemic started back in March, throughout the world, numerous Sefer Torah have been started to unify. They're called United Sefer Torah. One of the most famous is, if you are about, and we are doing it, and much part of it. There's one for Australia, which I can't remember what the website is, but the most famous one that they come down from, they did one for Australia. You can Google it, Torah for the virus, or United Torah. But there's one which is called unitedforprotection.com. You go there, you buy a letter, and through that it's a spiritual protection. Every Jewish person is supposed to own a letter, no matter what, and that's considered your way of protecting yourself. Now, going forward to 1827, in 1827, in the city of Orsha, which was a small city near the town of Lubavitch, which is where, of course, Chabad comes from, the Rebbe at the time was the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe. He was out of town, so his successor, who was his son-in-law, was asked what they should do about this new pandemic that had started. And he said that in addition to saying that portion of the incense, which was instituted by his grandfather, of course, we mentioned earlier, not instituted only, but he says there's a famous statement in the Talmud that tzedakah tatzil mimavet, giving extra charity saves one from death. And he started a concept. He says that people should add in charity, particular in a time like this, in a pandemic era. And he said that you should try to give those charity. It's not so much about, of course, we should add in the amount, but also add in the amount of times that we do. He said ideally we should be giving more than a few times a day, before our morning service, before our afternoon service, and in increments of 18. So 18 cents, $18, etc., or 36, or however it goes. That was his advice. in 1827. There was another plague in Israel in 1848, where once again they wrote to the Tzemach Tzedek. Now he was already the formal Rebbe. And in that time, he gave slightly different advice in addition to the above advice. He said that those 100 blessings that King David instituted to stop plagues, we should be more careful with those 100 blessings and make sure that when we say the 100 blessings, we should have in mind to concentrate and to really focus on their meaning. Okay, so that's the next stage. Going a little bit further, we come to something which is quite bizarre. In 1892, there's the famous town in Europe known as the town of Abt. And there was a terrible cholera epidemic where we're told that there was some 4 or 5 people dying from a small community of 6,000 Jews. And 4 or 5 people a day dying, of course, is a significant amount. So they went to, it's written down, it doesn't mention the name, but it says that the prominent citizens of the town went to a holy rabbi and they asked him to pray. And he said that what they should do is they should find a couple that needs to get married, that is in need of assistance, a young man that perhaps doesn't have the money to get married or whatever it is, and support them, and they should make the wedding in a cemetery. So they found a young man who was being supported by the community, and then they found a young woman who was called a Kala Dike Yosoma. Kala Dike Yosoma means a circled Yosoma. What does that mean? That she had lost both parents. And they went to them and said, would you two like to marry each other? And I suppose whatever they did in those days, they met and they were happy to get married. And they performed the wedding. It was a solemn celebration, but with lots of joy. And apparently the whole entire town came to this wedding in the cemetery. And they did it near the burial places of some of their holy past people, residents of that town. And the saying was, we have now taken care of our needy and helped them build a family and go on. Please now pray on our behalf. And the story goes on that this community actually, after this wedding, immediately the plague stopped, the cholera epidemic ended. That's the way that story finishes. We know that in Cobb's Creek in 1918, during the horrific Spanish flu flood, which is some 18 to 20 million people died, they also did a wedding in a cemetery. And even in this pandemic, there was famously a wedding done in Israel in a cemetery, and I believe even in America there was a couple that did a wedding over there. Something strange, and I'm sure it has some type of benefit for all these things. Now, this whole concept of making a wedding in a cemetery is not a very simple idea. It's somewhat fraught with problems, because halakhically you're not allowed to just make a wedding in a cemetery. It's actually forbidden. Why? Because we know that we're not supposed to do any mitzvot in a cemetery, because it's like laughing at the dead, that they're not able to perform the mitzvahs. They're there, but they need a body to perform the mitzvahs. They don't have that body. So it's not a simple thing. It's generally not practiced, but I suppose for extreme circumstances, it's somehow allowed. I'm not going to go into whether we should or shouldn't be doing it, but that's the situation in those cases. Now, what is this all based on? All these concepts are based on, it's all based on the very concept of strengthening ourselves in our Jewish practice during times of need. And it's a pasuk from Shemot. The verse says in Shemot, chapter 15, it says, if you hearken to the voice of the Lord your God, and you do what is proper in his eyes, and you listen closely to his commandments and observe all his statutes, all the sicknesses that I've visited upon Egypt, I will not visit upon you, for I, the Lord, heal you. So this is a clear statement from the Torah. The Torah tells us that in times of, if we want to avoid pandemics and issues in the first place, we should strengthen our Torah observance, and that is through prayer. Now, this concept is based on a fascinating idea from Ethics of Our Fathers. In Ethics of Our Fathers, before I get into that, when we're standing in Shul on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, and we say the famous Nisana Tokef. Nisana Tokef is the prayer where we go, who will live and who will die, etc. And we go through all different types of things that can happen to the person. And then we conclude that prayer, which I don't think will ever be more significant than this year. And it says, for those that recall, the Chazan is supposed to shout out, and everyone shouts out, Ose shuva, ose fila, tzedakah, ma'virin es roya gezeira. What does that mean? With repentance, teshuva, tefillah with prayer, with tzedakah, and with charity, we will get rid of the terrible decrees. Now that is a hint to the three, what were called the three pillars that the world stands upon. What do I mean? In Ethics of Our Fathers, we're told that the world stands on three pillars. What are those three pillars that the world stands upon? Is teshuvah, returning to God, having a strong connection with God, tefillah, prayer, tzedakah, and acts of kindness. If we are lacking in any of these things, not having that close connection with God, not praying and studying, or not being kind to one another, then we are listening. It's like if you had a table which was somewhat shaky. What do? You have to strengthen the legs, because if the legs are loose, the table's going to fall. So the Torah is telling us that if we're struggling, we should be strengthening these three pillars: Torah, tefillah, and tzedakah. Okay, going forward.
Oh, Rabbi?
Yes.
May I mention just reconciling, I suppose, the spiritual approach there to the governmental obligations to adhere to the rules and the restrictions. So would following all the laws and the commandments mentioned, would that also include the laws and commandments to follow the directives of the government in terms of face mask, distancing, etc.?
I'm not exactly understanding your question. Is it a question?
Sure. Yeah, there's a question, yes, because there are some people in their religious zeal may interpret as, I'll only do Torah, study Torah, spiritual, and I'll completely disregard the governmental directives as they relate to restrictions and face masks and so on. But I'm suggesting there's an interpretation about in that posuk about following all the commandments, which includes a commandment to comply with the public health directives.
Okay, so that's where we started with. That's exactly where we started the conversation. That we can listen reshus the rofa lirpos, that we are actually obligated to listen to the doctors about curing ourselves, about following directives, 100%.
And the doctors would include the public health officials that are in charge during the state of disaster.
100%.
Yep.
100%. Yes, and that is unfortunate, and I think that, in my personal opinion, is that it's overlooking this principle. That's my opinion.
Yep.
So I would agree with you.
I only mentioned it because it's not a hypothetical. We've had situations in Melbourne where that issue has happened in real life.
Yes.
Not with Chabad Dingley, but definitely not. But
I think it also depends on how people want to interpret it, and perhaps sometimes people get different advice. I wouldn't go into any specific examples
No.
because every example is different, and you would expect people to be getting the correct advice from their own community doctors, which may at times differ from what the governmental officials are saying. And you know, I would say that we're now in this extreme lockdown. Would you say that all doctors would agree that we should be in this? Of course not.
No.
I'm not saying that they are wrong, but that's a different conversation. That's a conversation of whether we have to listen to the law, which is a concept called Dina de Malchus Dina. The law of the state, if it doesn't override, it doesn't go against Torah, would be obligated to follow it. So that's a separate conversation.
And may I say that the approach nowadays by Hatzalah and the Jewish communal leaders is excellent. It's probably the highest level of compliance and logical approach that's available in Melbourne.
100%.
So the CSG, the Hatzalah, they're doing a fantastic job of sending out regular emails and educating people on how to comply.
100%. 100%. Okay. Let's go through just a few more ideas. If you bear with me, if you have to go, that's fine. I don't even know if you're leaving necessarily, so don't feel bad. We've reached one element of our class, so it's now 9 o'clock. So I want to finish a few more ideas, which is actually interesting about changes in life that different people speak about. So it's interesting how there's a particular man named Joshua Teplitsky, that he's a professor of history at Stony Brook University in the US, and he writes that he was doing research for the last 2 years on the plague in Prague in 1713, and to see how people responded, he found a particular man by the name of Anshel Wiener that seems to be one of the leaders, that on August 7, 1713, he wrote his last will, and he took that as an understanding that many people had taken the advantage of the epidemic to start writing their last will. And it's interestingly enough, it's not frowned upon. It's actually praised, and that's actually a protection from your life. They would say by doing these ideas, it actually helps and protects your life. The other thing is, of course, don't forget that to put some good Jewish causes in your will on your way out. But here's something which I found quite interesting. The word quarantine. Does anybody know where the word quarantine comes from? It's actually an Italian word, which I haven't got a chance to ask my wife yet. But it comes from the Italian word quaranta giorni. I'm probably pronouncing this totally wrong, and I'll ask my wife how to pronounce it. Giorni. My wife is actually talking at a different event tonight, so usually she's listening somewhere on Facebook or something so that I could have the computer. But so she's not even here to correct me, which is great. Quaranta giorni, which means 40 days. Why? Because during the 14th century, the Black Death, in order to prevent the spread, ships that came in from Venice had to quarantine inside the ship for 40 days before landing. How's that for interesting? We settle with 2 weeks, and we complain about that in a hotel, pull up with all your food and meals. They had to stay on boat. Remember, the first people that were quarantined in this epidemic were actually those people on boats as well. But that's where the word quarantine comes from. Now, of course, the Torah comes up with the concept of quarantine with the idea of the Metzora, with Tzoras, way back when, 3,300 years ago, which is why people thought that Tzoras was leprosy, and therefore they thought that leprosy was an infectious disease, although we don't necessarily believe that idea. However, we know that quarantine has been tremendously beneficial for many people. It's an opportunity to do all types of things that you never do. You know, paint that front yard fence and do your gardening, or in my case, make sure that the kids are well fed and don't make too much mess around the house. Whatever else you are able to do during quarantine, it sometimes is, we're told that Shakespeare apparently wrote some of his best works, Isaac Newton, developed his concept of calculus and the theory of gravity during a quarantine from an epidemic. And I suppose what I would say to myself, and I keep on asking myself, and unfortunately not always getting the answers that I want, is what am I doing to use out this time to benefit some of the greatest works? We're told about Reb Chaim Yosef Azulai that in 1774 he had to quarantine himself in Livorno, Italy, and he wrote a book called Shem HaGdolim, which is one of the greatest biographies of great rabbis that preceded him, and he's considered one of the great Jewish biographers as a result of writing this book while in quarantine, something that he probably would not have had time to write any other time. The Ramah, who we spoke about earlier, the author of the Ashkenazic version of Shulchan Aruch, he had to quarantine over Purim once when he ran away from Krakow, as we mentioned earlier. And as a result, he couldn't give Shalach Manos, the gifts, the food gifts to his father that he was used to giving. So he decided to give his father a spiritual gift. He wrote a commentary on the Megillah, which became a book known as Mechir Yayin. Here's another thing. Rabbi Akiva Eger that we mentioned earlier, that great Talmudist, he instituted something. We go to shul today. I remember once while I had a short stint, I was filling in for a rabbi in Elsterwick Shul, and one day we had a few guests. There was about 6 people saying Kaddish, and there was exactly a minyan on a Sunday morning, and nobody could keep up with each other. And I said afterwards that you should know that halachically only one person is supposed to say Kaddish, and the allowance to say Kaddish is only if the people can actually say Kaddish together. That's the ideal way. That you go to a shul, and unfortunately, where did this start from? During that epidemic, that I think it was the cholera in 1831. Sorry. There were so many people that were saying Kaddish, unfortunately. And in those days, till those days, the way it worked is every day a different person would say Kaddish. And they would go through, they would have a routine who said Kaddish that day. But because there was so many people saying Kaddish, so because of all those people that had passed away, people wouldn't be giving an opportunity even once a month. So because of that, Rabbi Akiva Eger instituted a new law that people are allowed to say Kaddish more often than once altogether. Sorry, that all people can say Kaddish, and that's remained the Jewish custom since then. That's something that has changed as a result. Another example that we're seeing in our times, something that we've never heard of before, that in densely Jewish populated areas, like in New York and all over Israel, there's something called the porch minyanim and the street minyanim, which have popped up. Something that a few months ago you would have thought people are meshuga to do. You know, we do that in the middle of Hanukkah events in the middle of a park, maybe, but that's like a one-off. Here, you had people bring out the Torah on one balcony and sing loud enough. And that, thank God, I think it's been quite a beautiful thing that you see. I read one article somewhere of this one person, a non-Jewish person, saying that the one thing I'm going to miss more than anything, I think it was somebody actually in Belgium, right? The one thing I'll miss more than anything is hearing these Jewish people singing outside their houses. So something that I think may say, and of course, online study, like we're sitting here on Zoom and Facebook studying together, we weren't so good about it earlier, but we found a way, and I'm hoping that people will come back to sit and actually be opposite me, that I could have you the same height as my camera. I don't have to look down upon you, so to speak. And see all of you in one shot. But it definitely has helped our communities adapt, and I think that we've, as Jewish people, we move with the cheese, you know, and as our cheese moves, we go and we grow, and this pandemic is going to just bring out tremendously beautiful and new things. Like 18 for 18 and Sinai Down Under and Zoom Shiurim, all these beautiful things. So hopefully it will stay. Now, a few other important things just to conclude with. One of the tremendous things that Jewish people have really adapted to in times of need was Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. And during times of pandemic, of course, this was very, very important. Rab Chaim Soloveitchik, who lived between 1853 and 1918. He's one of the greatest Talmudic scholars of his time. He went personally and attended people that were afflicted with cholera. However, he did say that if people were so extremely or negatively affected, you should not go to visit them, because if it's going to put a serious risk to your life, then you're not allowed to, if there's other people to take care of them. Famously, also the Rebbe, in the Rebbe's mother, Rebbe Tzimchana, the Lubavitch Rebbe's mother, she writes, she's got a book called Memoir. It's called Memoirs, Mother of Israel. It's been retitled Mother of Israel. You can find it on Chabad.org or buy it from your local Jewish store. But she writes that when the Rebbe was 20 years old, he studied all day. But he says that there was a typhus breakout, and the Rebbe stopped his studies, and he went from person to person, and he, with risk to his own life, saving lives. Unfortunately, he said that he became terribly sick. We didn't know if he was going to survive, because he was infected with the illness, and she was really afraid for his life. But that was our very own Rebbe. And of course, that's what people are doing, our frontline workers and chesed workers, and all the chesed that is going on throughout the world to help people. Now, as I would like to just say in conclusion, that of course we don't want these pandemics, and we wish and we pray for the very end of them, and that it should all end. But there's a famous story about I can't even remember who it was, but he was a survivor. He was a Rebbe. I think it was maybe one of the Ger Rebbes, and he survived the Holocaust. And after the Holocaust, he was regularly seen crying. And his Hasidim asked him, "We don't understand. During the Holocaust, you never cried, but since the Holocaust, you cry all the time." And his response was, "During the Holocaust, I thought that perhaps this was the start of a new era and the birth pangs before the coming of Mashiach. Now that I see that the world has gone back to awful, I now cry about this." Reuven is shouting, "Efa Mashiach." He says, "Now that I've seen that Mashiach hasn't yet come, I wonder what was it all worth." So it's written in some of the commentaries on the Haggadah. If you remember the Haggadah, I was telling people that when the Jewish people left Egypt, if they would have prayed not just to leave Egypt, but to have the ultimate redemption, God would have granted them. So while we pray that we should get back to normal life, we don't pray only to get back to normal life. We pray that we should be returning to something much greater and much better than normal life, the coming of Mashiach. That's the prayer of Jewish people always, especially in the time of a pandemic. So that's where I'll end off. If anybody has any further questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, speak, say your stories, your words. The shiur is now formally over, but please feel free to say whatever you wish.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Mendel. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley, for joining us.
It was beautiful. Thank you very, very much.
You're very welcome. We'll be having lots more interesting topics, hopefully, coming up
Wonderful.
Over the next few weeks. I would, if anybody wants to share me some feedback on doing a shiur like this with the PowerPoint in the background, and what people feel about the style of a shiur. I've been a little bit afraid of doing this type of shiur while on Zoom, and I thought, finally, let me give it a go. And I saw this beautiful shiur offered by JLI, but I wouldn't mind some feedback. It could be, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you, Yana. Just know, if you like the style of the PowerPoints, etc., or if you don't, you could say over here, or you're welcome to send me private feedback.
Rabbi Heller, Leon and Irene, we thank you very much. I feel that you delivered a very good PowerPoint tonight, and I commend you.
Thank you, Leon, and thanks for joining.
Pleasure.
And also regards to Irene. So
Thank
we
you.
really appreciate having you. Thank you so much.
Okay. All the best.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? No?
Oh, thank you very much.
And Noach, you should be proud. I finally got the background screen working.
Looks great. Looks excellent.
Thanks.
Yeah, I got some type of green screen which and changed the camera, so it seems to be working. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ruvain. Ruvain, you wanted to ask about Mashiach. Where's the Mashiach? I don't know.
Maybe tonight is come. I don't know.
Amen, amen, amen. Bezrat Hashem.
Amen. Amen.
God willing. Bezrat Hashem. We should only hear good news, please God.
מתפללים, מתפללים, מתפללים כל יום.
Amen. Ken. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shelley. Regards to
Thank you,
Cloud,
thank you.
please.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
for
Have
your
a good
efforts.
night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Very good.
Thank you, Joe. Have a good night.